And Secretary Nielsen, thank you for
Good afternoon.
being here today and for being here at a critical time. You're in the process of putting your own imprint on a massive organization that was created by Congress some 16 years ago and has never been reauthorized since. And I appreciate the fact, Mr. Chairman, that you and the ranking member, Senator McCaskill, have worked hard on a authorization bill, again, for the first time in almost 2 decades. It's overdue, in my view, and I think there's a lot of positive things in that bill. So we appreciate your working with us. I asked you earlier today in a conversation what you thought about it, and I think you're generally supportive of it.
Yes, sir.
And I hope you'll work with the chair and ranking member to get that not just to the Senate floor for a vote, but to get that signed into law. There are a number of provisions in that bill that I feel strongly about. One is some of my provisions to strengthen security for nonprofit institutions, focusing research on some emerging threats, as was talked about earlier, in the cybersecurity space, also in chemical weapons, as well as some important requirements to combat the illicit opioids that are coming into our country. You know, we here in my state of Ohio have had epidemic levels of opioid addiction and overdoses and deaths, starting with prescription drugs and heroin. And now it's this synthetic heroin or synthetic opioids, including fentanyl, carfentanil, and others. And it's now the big problem. I mean, we had 60% of the people who died in Ohio last year, our worst year ever, died because of fentanyl. Locally, in Columbus, Ohio, they just issued a report from that county, Franklin County, that 2/3 of their deaths last year were attributable to fentanyl. It's coming in through the U.S. mail system primarily. That's what all the experts say, including testimony before this committee and before our permanent subcommittee investigations. So our own United States mail system is providing the conduit for this poison. It's not coming overland from Mexico as heroin was. It's, at least the vast majority of it is not. Most of it's coming from China. We know where it's coming from. We know how it's coming. And we know that the post office, unbelievably, does not require the same information on packages as other private carriers have to in order for law enforcement to identify those packages. So the post office has about 900 million packages a year, by far the most, more than FedEx, UPS, DHL combined. Again, those private carriers have to give law enforcement, including your good folks at Customs and Border Protection, the information. They can then find these packages that are suspect, where it's from, what's in it, where it's going. Post office, for the most part, doesn't have that because we do not have a requirement on them. The requirement was put in place on the other carriers right after 9/11. And the thought was that the post office would do it also because we required that they do a study of it. They said it would take them some time. It's been 16 years, and they're still studying it. So our legislation that many members of this committee have strongly supported, I see Senator Hassan here, for instance, she's been a big advocate of this, as have others, is just to say, let's make the post office also give your people what they say they need. And they've testified before us here that they need it and need it badly. Senator Carper, who was here earlier, and I conducted a year-long investigation into this issue through the permanent subcommittee investigations. We were able, by using some undercover folks from your department, thank you for lending them to us, to find out some really shocking news, which is that people are selling this stuff online freely, not worried about the enforcement side, and saying if you send it through the post office, it's guaranteed. If you send it through a private carrier, it's not. And bottom line is, you know, in this authorization legislation, we have some good things about helping with regard to working with the Chinese government, to information sharing, but the central issue here, the real gap in our defenses against this drug coming in is the delivery method. So I hope you'll work with us. What your people will tell you is it's like finding a needle in a haystack if you don't have this information. If you have it, at least you have a fighting chance of both stopping some of this poison from coming in, that is the most powerful, potent drug ever, 50 times more powerful than heroin, but also increasing the price of the drug just by reducing some of that supply, because one of our problems right now in my state and others is the fact that this is not only readily available, it's relatively inexpensive. You're aware about the legislation, because we've talked about it, the STOP Act. You're aware of the fact that we are trying very hard to get this through the process right now, not just this committee, which has done, I think, a very good job on doing the research, but the Committee of Jurisdiction. I guess my question to you would be, are you willing to help us to get this done? And in particular, we've heard rumors that the House may move on something that is a watered-down version. They, by the way, have 270 co-sponsors of our bill, and yet the committee, their Ways and Means Committee, apparently is talking about giving the post office more time to do this, not having a requirement ultimately because there'd be no penalties associated with it. I guess I would ask you, are you willing to work with us and stick with us to ensure that we can require the post office to provide this information to your law enforcement folks so we can stop more of this deadly poison from coming in?
Yes, absolutely. You have my commitment, and I know, as you know, you have that of Commissioner McAleenan as well.
The Commissioner's been great as acting and now as Commissioner. We appreciate it. Well, I thank you. We want to work with you on it. With regard to the H-2B visa program, let me just read you one email that I got this week, last week actually now, from a landscaper in Ohio. I've talked briefly about this issue. He says, Rob, we've got $8,000 in revenue per day. We are not able to capture, or $250,000 a month. We will close $2 million under our budget for the year, which means we will lose close to $1 million this year. This is a small landscaper. This is just because he cannot rely on the labor force that he has relied on in the past. Can you just tell us briefly what your commitment is? You and I have talked about this with regard to the H-2B rule, getting it through OMB, and then what you think ought to be done in terms of a legislative visa cap.
Yes. The difficulty with the reg process is it's the reg process. I'll just be honest. We go as fast as we can, but the APA requires us to do certain things that takes a while. What we've tried to do is mimic the rule from last summer so that it can go as quickly as possible. The more changes, if we had made them to that underlying reg, the longer it would take. And I completely understand that time is of the essence. So what we chose to do is do something as quickly as we can under the APA. What I had mentioned to you earlier, and I mentioned earlier in testimony, was that the best way to fix this, is to take all of the information that the members have, which I'm gathering, everyone I've talked to, you as well, I said, please give me examples of companies that are going out of business because of either the problems with the seasonality or because there's not enough, to package it up, give it back, and just put it in law. That will give the companies predictability. They'll understand how many visas will be available, and they'll understand when. Right now, as you know, it's tied to the appropriations process, which it's anyone's guess when we can get that through. So it's very difficult on businesses.
Well, I would agree with your approach. My time is coming to an end. Just to say that, meanwhile, right now we need relief. And then finally, with regard to unaccompanied kids, I don't have time to go into it, but we have information now from you all as of 10 days ago that on July 30, you will have a new deadline to deliver the joint concept of operations, which we really need, both for the sake of these kids not to be trafficked or abused, but also to be sure, as Senator McCaskill said, these kids actually show up at their court proceedings, and that's not happening now for a lot of kids. So the memorandum of agreement's good. We want to get this joint operations concept in place in order to ensure these kids are protected. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.